Hi, listener. This is From Ideology to Unity, a spiritual journey where we let go of ideological doctrine and ego in favor of meaning, purpose, and unity as a whole. Today, I'm alone again because it's Christmas. It's kind of harder to get interviews. And what I'm going to be reading and reviewing is the Red Book of Jung, A Journey into Unknown Depths. So, this is going to be good, I think. I'm going to enjoy it. So, I'm not sure, to be honest, if this is the actual Red Book or a book about the Red Book. But it's definitely dealing with the ideas involved. So I think that it's going to be, pretty good. It's about the same length actually as Synchronicity, to be honest, maybe slightly longer. So what is this? Well, what I can tell you before reading it, from what I've heard, is that this is the book that changed the course of Carl Jung's career. And if you're wondering who he is, he's a psychologist. He was mentored by Freud, and Freud's approach was very much materialistic and very much in the perspective of just, you have the theory, the abstract theory, and you apply them to people, rather than investigating people, analyzing the emotional contents and developing theory about them based on that, which is more what Jung sought to do. And where they started differing was when Jung really started investigating his own subconscious, his own, well, the unconscious, or his own shadow. He started investigating it for himself and making notes essentially on what he found, because he started getting visions of, before World War I, he started getting visions of what was going to happen. He started getting visions of war and conflict and devastation across the continent. And this was about a year before World War I. And it really shook him, this vision he saw. And he had this vision of like Siegfried or something when he went into his unconscious. And I have a sense that this is something this is going to be going into by this book. So I also know that it goes into, I also just briefly glimpsed through, and it mentions Abraxas, which is an interesting Gnostic being as well. And yeah, that's quite interesting. Gnosticism is quite interesting to me because out of all the religions or sects or what have you, it has a lot in common with the Law of One. So, all right, so this is written by Walter Burichat. It's published by Routledge, Taylor and Francis Group, London and New York. Translated from the original Brazilian edition by Carolyn Hogarth. First published in 2017 by Karnak Books Limited. Karnak being an interesting reference to Egypt there. I'm not sure if that was deliberate or not, but it seems like almost like a synchronicity perhaps. So it's published in 2 Park Square, Milton Park, Abingdon, Oxon, OX14 4RN. So but that's in UK. It's also got a address in the US. So 711 3rd Avenue, New York, New NY10017 USA, right? Hopefully that's not too dark because I'm just dealing with it for I suppose legal reasons. Okay, it's also got excerpts from Lament of the Dead, Psychology After Jung's Red Book by James Hillman and Sonu Shammazdani, C.G. Jung, a biography and books by Sony, by the same person, and the Red Book in Liber Novus by Carl Jung, reproduced by kind permission of W.W. Norton, and also excerpts from Ion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the South by Carl G. Jung, reproduced by permission of Princeton University Press. Ion is a book that I haven't actually got. I don't think I got it anyway, because, yeah, I don't think I got it because I've got Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, and it's quite similar from what I hear in terms of what it covers. So, without further ado, I'm going to start reading. And when I come up with ideas or thoughts or inspirations or critiques, I will say what comes to me. I imagine this might be like a 6-parter or something. Now, honestly, I don't know if this is the best way to do it. I know that there's definitely YouTubers who, or what have you, who have a different method where they will read the whole thing, take notes, give analysis of having read it, you know, and they'll have this highly edited video. However, I decided to be a podcaster, right? I didn't decide to be a vlogger. In fact, I tried vlogging before as a podcaster at one point, and I don't know, maybe I just didn't find the right way to do it, but it wasn't like, it didn't work for me. It kind of took all the editing and all of that and getting delivery right. It took the passion out of it. Whereas this way of doing it, I can just talk and flow, you know? So if I end up doing 6 hours of content or something, then I do 6 hours of content. So yeah, I know it's a slow start, but I'm just giving you an introduction here. Okay. So let's start reading, huh? This book is dedicated to Paula, a constant companion in my personal journey through life. List of abbreviations: CW, collected works of Carl Jung in 20 volumes. DR, Memories, Dreams and Reflections. RM, the Red Book, Liber Novus. So I wonder if you'll remember that when I'm actually reading those abbreviations out, because I'm not sure if I will. We'll see. Okay, so first of all, there's this interesting picture. It seems to be, it's an interesting picture of Philemon with the PH at the beginning. So anyone who sees the YouTube video of this, you can look at the picture. Interesting. There seems to be sort of Gnostic crosses in that, and there's a snake that seems to indicate Abraxas in some sense, perhaps. And the earth, natural, like animalistic instincts, perhaps. There's a temple. I wonder if that's the Kingdom of God. I don't know. Honestly, I'm running out of guesses here. That was an interesting picture. That's from the Red Book by Carl Jung, right? All right. He gives acknowledgements to his students and Sonu Shamdazani, but I'm not going to go into those details about the author. Skip that. Well, let's start with the preface by Sonu Shamdasani. 30th of December 1913, Küsnacht, Switzerland. In the dead of winter, Jung finds himself in his fantasies in the Libyan desert, and encounters the old Christian anchorite, Ammonius, and finds him reading. At this stage in his career, Jung had done not a little reading, as well as a voluminous collection of wow, I am already doing great, right? This isn't hermetics, this is hermeneutics, hermeneutical analysis of texts in transformations and symbols of the libido. But Ammonius proceeds to give Jung's I a lesson in how to read a book. Surely you know that one can read a book many times, perhaps you almost know it by heart, and nonetheless, it can be that when you look at it again, at the lines before you, certain things appear new, or even new thoughts occur to you that you did not have before. Every word can work productively in your spirit. And finally, you have once left the book for a week, and you take it up again, for your spirit has experienced various different changes, and then a number of things will dawn on you. Ammonius goes on to explain to Jung's I that he reads the Gospels to seek their meaning which is yet to come. In this passage, Liber Novus, the book itself, in the voice of one of its personages, instructs us how to read it. I first read this dialogue in 1996, and it has haunted and instructed me as I continue to labor on the Liber Novus and Jung's Black Books in the asceticism of scholarship. Walter Burchat aptly characterizes Liber Novus as a Janus-faced work, pointing both to the future, the past and the future. As an historian engaged in the complex task of editing the work for publication, my gaze was necessarily fixed upon the past. For example, to contextualize the work and its genesis to facilitate its reading. To do this, it is essential to avert one's eyes from the concerns of the present. Liber Novus presents an unprecedented opportunity for a new understanding of Jung's thought, in particular, the interrelation between his esoteric work on his own fantasies and his exoteric scholarly works. At the same time, it holds open the possibility for reinvigoration of Jungian psychology. The former is the work of the historian, and the latter the task of the psychologist. Once published, the fate of a book depends upon its active reception, how those who take it up will read it, and in turn mediate it to others. Through translating Liber Novus into Portuguese, Walter Burchat has contributed to what Walter Benjamin would have called its continued unfolding in a new culture, enabling it to find a new community of readers. It has now taken up the challenge of reflecting upon what the book may hold for the future of psychological theory and psychotherapy. In doing so, he has provided bridges between past and the future of the book, opening paths which are salutary and instructive, and which provide an opportunity for Jungian psychology to begin again through relinking concepts with the imaginary ground from which they arose, and thereby refreshing them with new sap. Wow, that's powerful language. So, perhaps the collective unconscious or collective conscious is like a soil, and new nutrients can be brought in. It'd be a kind of soil where the nature of the soil and what it can grow depends on what nutrients you put into it, which isn't really how soil works. So my symbol is going a bit. The metaphor isn't really working anymore. But basically, you can refresh the cultural makeup, you can bring new ideas into it, and or at least the same ideas in a new way, and it can change things up. Anyway, that's what came to mind. Prologue. Opening the Red Book seems to be opening the mouth of the dead. James Hillman, Lament of the Dead. The Congress of the International Association for Analytical Psychology, IAAP, is held once every 3 years. In 2010, the IAAP Congress took place in Montreal, Canada, and the association brought together recognized Jungian institutions from around the world, and a large number of analysts from all corners of the globe participated, debating and evaluating new concepts and the theoretical cultural applications of analytical psychology. One of the most significant and perhaps long-awaited participants at the Montreal conference was Sonu Shamsadani, editor of the Red Book. Shamdazani took part in 2 events, an evening conference and an afternoon debate, and was enthusiastically applauded for both. Many of the analysts present had questions for the speaker. Rather significantly, a good part of these questions were preceded by words of gratitude for his valuable contribution to widening the understanding of analytical psychology and its concepts through his detailed research of the Liber Novus. This surely confirms both the strong impact of Liber Novus on the Jungian community and the importance of Shamsadani's work as an editor of the book. At the same time, however, this raises an unanswered question. What was the real contribution of the Red Book to the understanding of analytical psychology? Has the book had any type of significant influence on current approaches to Jungian clinical practice? These are questions that I hope to answer by the end of this book. President of the Jungian Analysts of Washington Association, coordinator of the panel which I participated, Janice Quinn, complimented almost in passing that the original copies of the book were being exhibited at the Library of Congress in Washington and had already been a huge success. This was very useful to know, as I was planning to return to Rio de Janeiro via Washington, where I would see my niece and revisit some of the city's landmarks, such as the fascinating Gallery of Art. That sounds like synchronicity, just saying. I had also planned to wander the beautiful streets of Georgetown, browse its books, and immerse myself in its past. After hearing this new information, I immediately added a visit to the Library of Congress to my itinerary. This is one of the United States' most important libraries, storing about 147 million documents and images, and over 33 million books written in hundreds of languages. Some of the most important documents that are kept there include the original records of the founding of the country and the Constitution, containing its fundamental Republican principles. When I arrived at the wide tree-lined area outside of the Library of Congress, the first thing I saw was a large banner advertising the Red Book exhibition, including photographs of Jung, the original copies of the book, and some of its images. The banner could be seen from far away and lent a certain prominence to the exhibition. It had been reported that the opening of the event had been meticulously planned and had been included lectures given by internationally recognized Jungian analysts. The exhibition was due to open after the launch of the book at the Rubin Museum of Art in New York, another sophisticated affair. I believe it to be significant that this careful and detailed exhibition of the Red Book was installed in the Thomas Jefferson Building at the Library of Congress, alongside the historic documents drawn up by the founders of the Republic. Could this exhibition be a symbol of wider acceptance of Jung's concepts after a century of their widespread rejection by academia? I think that makes sense. Could there now be an increased openness to accept the universe of the symbolic and the intuitive? Coming age of Aquarius? It may still be too early to say, and this book shall frequently return to this matter, but there is no doubt that analytical psychology has managed to penetrate and develop within many different aspects of culture, a fact that not even the most optimistic of Jung's followers could have imagined in decades past. I had another memorable experience regarding the Red Book when I was attending an administrative meeting for the IAAP Executive Committee in Zurich, where the committee usually meets once a year. The hotel where we met and February 2011, was located close to the small yet beautiful Red Book Museum, which displays exhibitions dedicated to non-European art, more specifically African and Asian art, with the usual Swiss diligence. According to the organizers, the museum had been chosen to exhibit the Red Book in Switzerland due to Jung's interest in Oriental art and culture. I walked a short distance from the hotel up a snowy tree-topped hill to find a well-organized museum with an entire section dedicated to the Red Book. It was undoubtedly a magnificent exhibition and included some of the paintings Jung had produced in his youth, drawings of mandalas, and a range of other creations from the time he was writing the Red Book. I was surprised to see a video in which Jung himself played one of the characters, sculpting the famous statue of the god Telesporos, whose name means bringer of completion, in his garden next to the Bollingen Tower. Among the most interesting examples of Jung's work was the statue portraying the phallic god of his childhood dreams, to which he gave the name Atmaviktu, meaning breath of life. The statue was left by Jung in the gardens of his house in Kuznacht. More recently, the Red Book earned a prominent place at the 2013 Biennale. The theme of the exhibition was the Encyclopedic Palace, an imaginary museum that was created to contain the entire knowledge of humanity, from the discovery of the wheel to the invention of the satellite. Liber Novus and its images were on one of the main displays, demonstrating the book's cultural importance. These events occurring across the whole world and the translation of the book into a range of languages point towards the enormous impact this work has had on students and researchers of analytical psychology and the wider public. It's still too early to be able to understand the full extent of this influence. However, the simple fact that some of Jung's most remarkable and fundamental ideas are finally coming to the fore is something to be celebrated. That's probably not a coincidence either. Where was I? Oh. Somehow I lost where I was there. Okay. Oh, that's it. Turn 2 pages at once. Chapter 1, Introduction. The Red Book, or Liber Novus, as Jung calls it, has become the object of intense curiosity since the publication of his memoir, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, 1963. Jung refers to the Red Book in the chapter entitled Confrontations with the Unconscious, when he describes the crisis he experienced soon after his separation from Freud in 1913. One of the book's appendices refers to the Red Book and the meaning it had in Jung's life. While it was being written between 1913 and 1930, copies of the book were circulated within a small group of people in Jung's intimate circle. On some occasions, passages and images from the book were published, some of which appear in the book C.G. Jung, Word and Image, for example, which was edited by Jung's secretary, Anelia Jaffe, 1979. It contains a section dedicated to the Red Book and comments on some of its images. The book did not have any further exposure, as Jung's final decision was not to publish it, although this must not have been without some ambivalence, as in various parts of the book it is clear that despite everything, Jung wanted his work to be known. Nearly 40 years after his death, Jung's heirs gave their permission for the Red Book to be made available to the public. This authorization was given after much debate in the year 2000. Just remember that annoying pop song. Well, at the turn of the century and a time of great cultural change, Jung gave the title of Liber Novus to this work. But why? The book is truly original and has an almost medieval appearance, with Gothic prints and beautiful, intricate illustrations drawn by the author himself interspersed throughout the text. These illustrations were an original way of expressing subjective experience that would be hard to describe solely through the logic of language. These were the symbolic tool that Jung used to express the inexpressible content he discovered from the boundaries of the comprehensible. As this book will reveal, images appear at times when logical explanations or descriptions are no longer sufficient, and Jung makes use of this form of aesthetic expression in order to express himself at these moments. The man chosen to edit the book was the Singapore-born English historian Sonu Shamdasani. Shamdasani is a researcher who studied the history of medicine and psychoanalysis, and has also conducted essential historical research into analytical psychology. Shamdasani, 1995 and 2003. The choice of an historian to edit Liber Novus, as opposed to a Jungian analyst, emphasizes the historical links between creative experiences contained in the Red Book, which the theoretic concepts in the author's complete works being formulated as a result of these experiences. The launch of Shamdasani's exquisite edition of the Red Book took place in October 2009. The international response was considerable, and the book was almost immediately translated into a range of languages. In December 2012, I would say that it was 2012 is certainly not a coincidence, given that the transition period between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius began in 2012. Anyway, in December 2012, the book had already sold over 100,000 copies, not only in the original English, but in a range of languages, including German, Italian, Spanish, Japanese, Portuguese, French, Czech, and Romanian. The Red Book was the principal initiative by the Philemon Foundation, an organization dedicated to publishing the entire works of Jung, and which had already published a number of his other works, Jung 2007, 2008, 2012, 2014. Research into Jung's unpublished work shows that the 20 volumes published within his collected works do not include all of his writings. In fact, the volume of his unpublished work is practically double of the work that has been published to date. The Routledge and Princeton University Press collection of Jung's published works are titled collective works and not complete works. Various seminars, letters, communications, and conferences have still not been published, including the Red Book. All of this comprises a wealth of material for research into Jung's work that is awaited with great interest. In a book published a few years ago, Shamdasani 2005 states that the publication of Jung's complete works is essential in order to gain a more accurate picture of one of the founders of analytical psychology. The researcher has studied a range of his biographies and revealed that much of the information provided about Jung paints a picture very different to the real man, distorting perceptions of the analytical psychologist and his work. The publication of the Liber Novus is part of the movement to seek the real Jung and rediscover the basic premises of analytical psychology. An impressive video showing the complex editing process of the original work in German carried out by the Philemon Foundation is available on the internet. The first edition, printed out by the Anglo-American publishing house W.W. Norton, then went on to sell out on Amazon.com and other such sites before it even arrived at the bookshops. Liber Novus can be considered, without any fear of exaggeration, to be one of the most important book releases of recent times. The revelations contained in the autobiography Memories, Dreams, Reflections made a bigger impact, but Liber Novus has made an even more of an impression as a result of its rich symbolic content, its sincere confessional style narrative, and its fundamental role in the genesis of Jung's creative work. Shamdasani shed some light on the relevance of the Red Book and the genesis of Jung's later theoretical work in his introduction to the 2009 publication. He recalls that the book was completed in the autumn of 1913, by which Jung had clearly organized a wide range of the theoretical developments that constituted the basis of his ideas. It is worth remembering that at the time Jung had already developed his entire theory of complexes using his word association test. His work in this area began. Worth remembering that at this time Jung had already developed his theory of complexes using his word association test. His work in this area began in 1902 at the Burkholz-Zierli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich. At the time, he had already developed his entire theory on psychological dynamics of the neurosis and psychoses. In addition, he had postulated the basis of his theory on psychological types, which concepts of extroversion, introversion, and the polarity between thought, published in his book Psychological Types in 1921. He had even outlined the initial description of two layers of the unconscious, one personal, the other collective, and containing a Bilden, German for primordial images, Jung, 1911. These were the prototype for his concept of the archetypes and their associated images, which he detailed in the revised and expanded edition of Symbols for the Transformation of 1951. It is worth emphasizing that the edition of Symbols of Transformation that is normally referred to is found in volume 5 of the collected works, which was revised and expanded by Jung in 1951. In this edition, the concepts of the archetypes and the archetypal images can clearly be seen in their final form. Subsequent created offshoots that were a direct result of the experiences contained in the Liber Novus refer to the individuation process, the central concept of Jungian theory, as well as the various mythologized and personified figures of the persona, the shadow aspect, the anima and the animus, and the collective symbology of the self, with its abstract representations, such as the mana personalities, in which the Liber Novus are mainly embodied by the magician Philemon, his inner guide. Jung himself states that the Red Book was the basis of his entire subsequent creative process. The configurations that appear in the Red Book were first elaborated in the essay The Structure of the Unconscious, published in 1917 as an appendix to Volume 7 of the collective works. This include the persona as a form of compromise between the ego and the need for social adaptation, the shadow figure, the personification of content that is not compatible with the conscious, but at the same time represents the seed required for future development of the personality, the anima and the animus, which represent the personification of the opposite gender in the unconscious, and the self as the representation of the central organizer of the psyche, and at the same time its totality. The presence of these figures throughout the maturation process of the personality and their guiding role during the psychotherapeutic process are what make Jungian psychoanalysis such an extremely personal and vivid experience. Well, honestly, I'm not sure what to say about these archetypes, because I mean, they're great, right? And that is quite a good summary of it. The book is first and foremost a vivid and candid demonstration of the active imagination technique that Jung systemized to enable a creative approach to accessing the images of the unconscious. Liber Novus in its entirety is a constant unfolding of an extremely productive process of active imagination, containing a polyphony of inner voices, creative dialogue, and a range of autonomous inner images, and the gradual integration of the conscious and the potential of the creative unconscious. The purpose of this book is not to exhaustively analyze all of the elements contained within the Red Book, Liber Novus, is to is not to analyze the contents within the Red Book. Full stop. Liber Novus is still undergoing a process of assimilation into contemporary culture. Its impact on the Jungian community and on psychology in general is still being discussed and evaluated. Stanford Job reflects on the possible effects of the book on contemporary psychology in general, 2012, And in 2011, the Journal of Analytical Psychology organized a symposium to evaluate its effects on the Jungian community. Some of the conclusions reached are discussed in Chapter 10. The purpose here is to raise some select issues of interest, which are significant not just in developing understanding Jung's work, but also shedding light on both the great mysteries of human nature and the new dimension uncovered by Jung and Freud, the universe of the unconscious and the possible ways to approach it. Okay, so that is the end of the introduction. Apparently, chapter 1 is the introduction. Okay. All right, so the gestation, chapter 2, the gestation of the book. My life is the story of the self-realization of the unconscious. It is with this powerful affirmation that Jung starts his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, 1963, page 17. The contents of Liber Novus gives testimony to this gradual process of inner content emerging in the conscious, and how by the author's creative impulse, this became integrated and later expressed his entire life's work. Jung's midlife crisis. Jung was in a transitional phase in his life when he started to write the Red Book, and he needed to reformulate his vision of the world. He had just broken with Freud, a decision that had cost him many of his friendships and the protection of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, which in 1913 had already gained significant notoriety across the whole of Europe. Jung was an important defender of this movement led by Freud, and was also the first president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, IPA. In 1909, he left Berkhoseley Hospital and his position as assistant doctor under the Dr. Eugen Bleuler, bringing to a close what is referred to as his psychiatric period, in order to embark upon his long and fruitful creative journey. The end of his relationship with Freud and the conclusion of his teaching work at the University of Zurich soon were the first of many institutional ties that would break during his lifetime. These significant changes gained metaphorical expression in the Liber Novus, in what Jung named a confrontation between the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. These were two voices that contradict each other and point out different paths. The spirit of the times represents institutions, the acquiescence of social groups, and the easy adaptation of values imposed from the outside, and superficial involvement with the values of the persona. The spirit of the depths personifies a new, renovating voice that springs up from somewhere deeper, a powerful summons. Somewhere deeper, a powerful summons that urges us to dive into an unknown inner world and travel the long road that has never been taken before. This voice is irresistible and calls those who listen to start new journeys. This entire process began with an impressive vision that Jung describes in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, 1963, as the beginning of a time of great difficulty, which he calls his confrontation with the unconscious. In October, while I was alone on a journey, I was suddenly seized with an overpowering vision. I saw a monstrous flood covering all of northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. I saw the mighty yellow waves, the floating rubble of civilization, the drowned bodies of uncounted thousands. This vision lasted about 1 hour. I was perplexed and nauseated and ashamed of my own weakness, Page 169. This vision from October 1913 turned out to be something of a premonition, as August 1914 marked the beginning of the First World War, a period of tremendous pain and destruction that left 3 million dead and uncountable suffering across Europe, the whole of Europe. The vision described in details the borders between European countries that would soon be covered in blood and the bodies of men sent to fight. However, given that Jung was going through an intense psychological transformation at the time, this vision should be understood in terms of its subjective meaning, as it also describes the internal revolution that the author was experiencing. Indeed, he was passing through what would later be called a midlife crisis in 1928. A moment of existential crisis. He would later name the midlife crisis, 1928. A moment of existential crisis around middle age when a person's interests are no longer focused on the outside world, love or professional achievement, and the inner world starts to become more important. This process was known in ancient Greece as metanoia, transformation of the mind, metanoia. He was 37 years old at the time, and two of the most significant manifestations of this profound inner transformation had already taken place. His breaks both with the prominent figure of Freud and the psychoanalytic movement in general. The concept of creative illness. Liber Novus appeared, therefore, during a time of great change, and it was during this period that the experiences contained within the Red Book started to take place. Oh, right. What are my thoughts on the previous page? So, actually, it's kind of self-explanatory in that it was a premonition of the future. Well, it suggests to me, well, synchronicity, I suppose. Time being all one moment, which is a law of one concept. I don't think he was aware of that. However, I would say it aligns with that. Jung's experiences can be understood as part of the process that Swiss historian Henry Ellenberger defines as the creative illness, 1974. He describes acute psychological crises during which the creative personalities pass through a period of introspective isolation, self-questioning, and difficulty in adapting to their daily routine. Although, if I accidentally started to say collective there, perhaps this is something the collective as a whole is going through. And this great tumult that we're going through is on a much larger time scale, on a more larger scale in terms of numbers of people, the whole global society undergoing the same sort of process at the end of this ion and the beginning of the new one. Or the new age. After this period, they emerge invigorated with new ideas, concepts, and truths that can benefit the whole of society. A similar process happened to Gustav Fechner, considered to be one of the fathers of psychoanalysis, who, after a personal crisis that caused him to lose his vision, came up with his concept of the pleasure principle, probably one of the precursors to Freud's concept of the libido. Freud himself also went through his own creative illness, confronting issues of incest, patricide, childish sexuality during his self-analysis. He started to suffer from fainting spells when visiting his father's grave. These blackouts, which were symptoms of his creative illness, were the way in which Freud expressed a profound conflict between his subconscious parricidal impulses and his feelings of guilt for the real death of his father. Freud began to worry that he may be hysterical. Freud's fainting, Fechner's blindness, and Jung's altered states of consciousness are cited by Ellenberger as some examples of creative illness. The term creative illness has been criticized for pathologizing something that is not a sign of illness but of health. Ellenberger's term is controversial as it employs two words, one of them relating to something desirable and essential, the other to something undesirable and pathological. I believe his approach to be valuable, as creativity always appears somewhere on the boundaries of the pathological, even though these can be considered to be opposites. This demonstrates a veritable conjunctio oppositorum, as Jung would call it, the unity of opposites in the unconscious. Well, man, I wish I had something to say other than I agree. It seems linked on some level to, psychologically speaking, a correspondence to chaos versus order, and there being a way between. And you could say creativity could be mad in a sense, but also a lack of creativity could be madder. Choose your crazy, right? Creative types must navigate around the snares of the pathological in the same way that an alchemist would transform lead into gold. Well, that fits what I was saying. Yeah, exactly. Liber Novus is a continuous process of transformation between these poles. The limits of between creativity and the pathological in the Red Book will be described in more detail in chapter 5. The matter at hand is how much Jung as a person was transformed by the inner process that resulted in the production of Liber Novus. In fact, Liber Novus can be seen as a form of self-analysis that was created by Jung, in which he was the patient, the method, and the therapist. This intense confrontation with the unconscious would form the basis for his own therapeutic method. Jung wrote of how this process unfolded. Jung, 2009. When I had the vision of the flood in October of the year 1913, it happened to me at a time that was significant for me as a man. At that time, in the 40th year of my life, I'd achieved everything that I had wished for myself. I'd achieved honor, power, wealth, knowledge, and every human happiness. Then my desire for increase of these trappings ceased. The desire ebbed from me, and the horror overcame me. Came over me. Page 231 to 232. Raises the question of what happens when the ego is actually truly satiated. If your goals that you've set yourself and your identity that you have, well, identified yourself around, if it's about achieving certain things and then you achieve it, who are you? Perhaps that is his issue, and maybe it's certain dissatisfactions that he was repressing. Perhaps. And then suddenly it comes to the fore. Something that we're going to have to consider in terms of what process he went through. We could follow his own methods for ourselves in order to deal with our own psychological trials. Because like dark nights of the soul are becoming increasingly frequent at this time because of the Great Awakening, because of the New Age of Aquarius, because in order to awaken, you need to confront your shadow. People start looking at spirituality and they're like, oh, it's great. And then suddenly all this negativity comes up from beneath. And we're like, what's going on? It can be quite difficult to deal with, but we become stronger from it and more balanced. His entire inner work and inherited personality as a man with a strict European education and sophisticated values was being called into question and swept away by the tide. The death of significant symbols, a real-life example of Nietzsche's reevaluation of all values, cast a shadow of doubt onto his previous references. Jung remembered at the time, quote, I thought my spirit had become ill. Page 231. The dramatic nature of the vision that Jung describes took took place as he was starting to write Liber Novus. At the same time, Europe was ascending into a crisis, the crisis of the First World War. This somewhat spontaneous vision took place on the train journey between Zurich and Schaffhausen. Jung's childhood dreams and Liber Novus. All of these occurrences that took place in the months leading up to the First World War may give the impression that the Red Book was a result of Jung's midlife crisis and his break with Freud, among other factors. However, I believe we should consider the psyche of this creative genius as part of a process that spanned his entire lifetime. I would like to suggest that we seek the genesis of Liber Novus, not in Jung's midlife crisis, but as part of his preceding psychological development. His childhood dreams and experiences describe the beginnings of a gradual process of development that simply becomes more evident in Liber Novus. He had already started a battle with existential questions early on in his life, at a stage when the child's ego is still undergoing the initial stages of organization and has a closer proximity to the symbols of the self that can foretell crises, existential questions, and basic problems associated with the individuation process. The first chapters of Memories, Dreams, Reflections gives us some important clues to understanding the Red Book. In addition, knowledge of Jung's family myths and cross-generational issues may facilitate the understanding of his later work, as Jung's creative work was the theoretical expression of his individuation process. His work was a reflection of his life. In order to gain a more precise idea of how unconscious material was already starting to emerge in Jung's psyche during the early childhood, it is worth remembering that he was born in 1875 in the Swiss countryside, in the medieval village of Keswil, in the canton of Thurgovia. At this time, the great modern innovations such as the car and aeroplane had still not been invented. In addition, Jung's father was a pastor of the Protestant church, and he grew up in a very religious family environment. His childhood and adolescence were dominated by religious ideals, and he lived an extremely traditional way of life. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he narrates the details of his childhood with moving serenity. He portrays how, as a child, the issue of spirituality emerged in his psyche with a great intensity, yet completely naturally. He developed with special connection to a particular stone, and while he was sitting on it, lost in thought, he was overcome with a strange fantasy. Was it him sitting on the stone, thinking about it, or was he being thought about by the stone? Another interesting passage describes how the young Karl had the habit of keeping a fire in a gap in the stone wall at his parents' house. This was his fire, the fire of life and the perpetual flame that must keep burning forever. Page 33. A powerful fantasy in which he had two personalities stayed with him from adolescence onwards. One personality was his younger self that lived his daily life and experienced his insecurities and uncertainties, which he called his personality number one. And the other was a serious old man from the 18th century, which he called his personality number two. He attributed this double personality to his mother, who was obese and protective, and on one hand was a conventional lady, and on the other was strangely unpredictable. Jung felt that he had inherited his mother's second personality, making him intuitive and perceptive on the irrational side of life. He provided an example of this by recounting an episode that took place at a wedding, where he invented a story to explain an issue he was discussing, and it turned out to be the exact life story of the person sitting in front of him. This caused him such a sense of unease he couldn't finish the story. Page 60. These examples indicate that Jung felt an early intuition that the unconscious could contain a center other than the ego, a more nuanced personality that represented a potential unconscious with values different from those belonging to the conscious. These intuitions would play a special role in Liber Novus, where Jung used metaphorical representations for this other center of personality, later conceptualized in his collected works as the archetype of the self, which appears in the Liber Novus as the spirit of the depths, embodied by Elijah and then Philemon. So, well, certainly an example of synchronicity we're given there. And multiple personalities are an interesting issue there. The first dream Jung could remember took place when he was very young, around the age of 3 or 4. In this dream, the young Carl discovers a passageway in the ground in a ravine close to the Presbyterian church where his father worked. Entering the passageway, he enters a room lit with a dim light. In the middle was a type of altar covered with a red cloth, where he saw an object in the shape of a tree trunk or flesh, with a single eye on the very top. He then woke up. He then heard his mother's voice shouting, "That is the man-eater." He woke up terrified. Wow. Made me think of Archons for some reason. This dream haunted Jung for his whole life and was so powerful that it became the source of many reflections that followed him into old age. This first dream contained the religious and metaphysical issues that were central to his thinking and formed the nucleus of his personal myth. And I think the eye seems to symbolize creation and the light of creation that comes from the eye, in a sense. Not literally. Relates to truth and light, and maybe it relates to what he did in his life. Clearly, Jung was going through the same process that all children go through in relation to their most significant dreams. Their personalities are still being formed and are still in very close proximity to the unconscious, meaning that magical thinking, fairy tales, and myths are still part of their everyday lives. Their dreams often contain intense archetypal material from the collective unconscious. The universal belief of children in guardian angels that protect them at times of great vulnerability is an expression of the proximity of the child's ego to the archetypes, and in this case, guardian angels are a personification of a childhood daemon, the guardian spirit. Although, for sure, I believe they are real. Your spirit guides are essentially the same thing, in my opinion. These great childhood dreams stay with them for the rest of their lives and are connected to their personal myth. And my one that I recall most is jumping in my dream, like jumping. There's this golf. I mean, if you don't want to listen to the previous episode, you might have, one of the previous episodes, you might have heard this. There was this gap between the stair banisters, and there was this golfing dark hole formed there, and I jumped down for some reason and fell and landed in my bed. And I used to keep having this dream. And maybe it's has to do with repeatedly jumping into the shadow, delving into the shadow, whether internally or in an external experience and actions. And perhaps this drive to do that, to go away from the path regularly traveled, I guess, and take more risks than my brother, perhaps. Perhaps that was to develop my unconscious more, to develop more from exposure to the shadow. I don't know. That just came to my head. The archetypal nature of important childhood dreams cannot be understood at first, and it is only much later that their complex meaning starts to make sense. However, this nucleus of subconscious representation has another symbolic power, has a great symbolic power, and reverberates over the years in one way or another, whether consciously or unconsciously. The conscious ego may or may not be able to assimilate this material, but it will affect the person's life regardless. In his later research into comparative mythology, which intensified during the first years of the 20th century, Jung noticed the importance of the cult of the phallus in his pre-Christian religions. In the pre-Christian religions and its hyphalic gods such as Priapus and Hermes, who represented the fertility of men and women, animals, and the earth. They ensured the continuity of life and the generations. These and other experiences gave the young Carl a sense of otherness during his childhood, making him feel very different to his school friends and the adults that surrounded him. At the same time, these experiences were a strong calling towards the individuality and his personal creative process. I imagine that these were choices that he made before his incarnation. A lot of our early experiences are. And why do we think that would be? Well, he is an example of someone who did their life work, did their dharma, what they had chosen to do before their life, and actually lived up to that. And he did what he loved. And perhaps he wasn't entirely doing what really set his soul afire, when he was doing more what Freud would have approved of. And partly he had to shift because he was getting a crisis from not fully really doing what he loved. The exclamation, "That is the man-eater," raises the question of cannibalism, which is associated with the foundations of religion. It was just around 40 years later, when researching mythology for his book published in 1911, Symbols of Transformation, that he started to understand the anthropological and mythological implications of his childhood dream. Chapter 13 of Liber Secundus, the second book of the Red Book, the sacrificial murder, can also be considered a rough treatment of this issue. And from what I've heard about what David Icke has written about Princess Diana's accidental death was ritualistically organized by the Cabal. That's what he says anyway. The dream of the subterranean phallus god contains many impersonal aspects and fits into the category of great archetypal dreams. This interpretation that Jung later gives of this dream is that it presented him with a chthonic deity in no way related to the canon of established religion. In fact, the young Carl had always regarded his father's relationship with religion as some suspicion, as the rituals he performed seemed automatic and devoid of any authentic religious experience. So, I mean, I remember growing up how meaningless the Christ story seemed to me. And I didn't really relate to the Old Testament either. But I wasn't really strongly brought up religiously. I just encountered it at school. And certainly a lot of us growing up, a lot of my generation, millennials and later, in fact, the more recently we're born, the less we can relate to organized religion unless we grew up in a particular community like that. So I mean, in my case, this is why I try to make sense of the world in a way without religion. And perhaps that's why when I started to make sense of politics, I started trying to make sense of it in my own way too. And perhaps I'm not alone in that either. I'm not going to compare it too strongly because he grew up in a religious society community, which is certainly not what I did. Unless you can call ideology a secular religion, which potentially it is. If I were to give an analysis of what I've read so far is actually, it's pretty good, right? It's actually a gold mine of content. It's just, I was expecting to have more to say as we would go along, but I suppose to me, it holistically gets together well. You get a good picture of his psychology as well as his ideas. I think it's pretty thought-provoking, for sure. It is what it is, right? He suffered a serious religious crisis during the First Communion and felt sorry for his father, whose convictions did not involve any religious authenticity. That word's been coming up a lot recently. The young Carl swore to himself that he would no longer participate in that kind of type of ritual. Telling truth is good. Yeah. The dream about the Archetypal God and Jung's other childhood dreams had a notable influence on the theoretical construct of analytical psychology. For those who have read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, it is clear that this theory is inseparable from the personality of its creator. Its themes and methods of approach reflect his unique personality. This is evident in the case of institutional religion. The underworld deity introduces the limitations of the traditional way that the gods are represented. As well as being pre-Christian, this deity relativizes the traditional Judeo-Christian representation of the divinity. Also, what springs to mind for me is, well, the Indo-European gods tend to be sky gods, or king chief gods tend to be sky gods, and these tend to be kind of the opposite of chthonic gods, in a sense. Chthonic meaning relating to the earth, perhaps of ice, as opposed to those of the sky. And as I have mentioned previously, it seems that it may well be linked to the Anunnaki, the Sumerian gods, who, if you've ever watched Ancient Aliens and you've seen Gaia, may well be aliens. Well, I believe they were aliens. And I don't know the relation between them and the underground reptilians, but yeah. Chthonic deities, I don't know where they fit into it at this point, but it's more to do with, the other thing was, sky gods tend to be paternalistic and represent an imbalance towards masculine energy, whereas chthonic tend towards representing more of a balance of energies with masculine and feminine, or perhaps more of a preponderance of female energy. And there is a theory that before the Indo-Europeans entered Europe, the religions predominant were more maternalistic, and the societies were more maternalistic. That's not necessarily to say dominated by women, but certainly that there was a more that authority wasn't seen as a male thing predominantly, whereas seemed to later become more the case. And also consider that the right brain, left brain distinction, while not being the full picture, and there is hemispheric bridging in people's minds, it is still a distinction, I believe, that does play out. And the overemphasis of the analytical male mind, I suppose, the object orientation rather than relations orientation that Simon Baron Cohen talks about, that is something that results from, well, you could say Archon influenced religion and society. Anyway, I'll get back to it. The importance of this dream at the beginning of Jung's life is reintroduced with the publication of Liber Novus and the research that resulted from this book. It is known that the final calligraphic copy of the Red Book was put together from annotations and unconscious experiences taken from Jung's Black Books. The Black Books were therefore the basis of the final text included in the Red Book. The first Black Book contained Jung's annotations on his dreams and fantasies up until, 1902. Yeah, perhaps I could do an interview. I could do an episode where I'm just burping the whole way through. Yeah. It is known that Jung was also looking back at his childhood dreams when he started writing down his intense fantasies and dreams in the Black Books again in 1913. According to Shamdazani, the dream about the subterranean phallus was actually a prefiguration of the Gnostic god Abraxas, the central figure in Liber Novus. Interesting. Now, something of notice, something of interest to me is there is an interesting video that I found called Contact 2020. You can look it up on YouTube, and it talks about Abraxas and Gnosticism and certain experiences the YouTuber has experienced. Because of that, my mind has, seeing that the other day, my mind has been more on Abraxas, the Gnostic deity, which is a deity that represents, that has involves a unification of opposites and other interesting features that I won't go into now. But yeah, it just seeing that come up there is interesting. And Gnosticism has relations to the law of one in how it portrays things, in that it's a form of panpsychism or pantheism, which the law of one is. So yeah. Another childhood experience that, Liber Novus and Jung's crisis with organized religion. Another childhood experience that Jung describes in Memories, Dreams, Reflections reinforces the importance that his religious crisis had on his life. On one occasion, at the age of 11, he was in the main square of Basel on a beautiful day with a clear blue sky. While contemplating the city's religious temple, he suddenly felt the impulse to have a forbidden and threatening thought that he feared would take over his consciousness. The thought continued to haunt him, and he had difficulty sleeping, and was so disturbed that his mother soon noticed there was something wrong. In the end, he had no other choice but to gradually let the thought enter his conscious. He thought about the city's temple, its golden roof, the blue sky, and God sitting on his throne, and suddenly he saw God defecating on the temple, completely destroying it and reducing it to rubble. 1963, page 50. I'm wondering, do you think it was the sheer force of God's defecation that did it? Or do you think it was the weight of it? Or something else? Okay. Not to detract from the actual. impact of that thought or image seems to represent, well, actually, no. I'll read what it says about that. This is a surprising and original fancy to have sprung from the unconscious of an 11-year-old boy, and it demonstrates Jung's total inability to believe in organized religion and his distrust of his father's values. At the same time, these images portray the need to seek personal original values so that he could express the transcendental. This representation of a new reinvigorating deity, different from the Judeo-Christian God, can be found in the Red Book and the form of the Gnostic god Abraxas. So I suppose there must have been a frustration with the established belief system that we were taught and conditioned to believe in, and that he was taught and conditioned to believe in. And there seems to be a sort of disrespect, perhaps even a contempt of it manifest there, but it wasn't consciously acknowledged. It was subconscious because he knew it wasn't accepted in society. So, but nevertheless, he had that thought and it bothered him. But yeah. The association between Jung's childhood dream and the Gnostic god in Liber Novus is important, as it touches on the difference between genuine spiritual experience and the dogma of organized religion, a key issue for Jung. According to John Dowley, 1990, the theory of religion in analytical psychology rests on three basic pillars: universalization, subjectivization, and relativization. Okay. Universalization is the understanding that genuine religious experience does not belong to any particular creed, but is part of being human, and that great mystical experiences have universal relevance. Now, this is something what I appreciate in Jung and analytical psychology, because unity is a key concept of the law of one, and the unity of being, and unity in general. And I feel like spirituality is like, it's not like there's one set of beliefs and that's right, and there's another set of beliefs and that's wrong, and the right ones need to fight over the wrong ones to make them defeated so that the right ones spread, and those who are wrong are bad people, blah, blah, blah. That is what we've got with organized religion a lot of the time. And universalization is so much more, it's this basic idea of like, do you really think you happen to have the correct religious values? That you happen to be born in the right place to have the right ones? That you're just lucky to be born in the right place? That you could have been born in the wrong place, but you're born in the right place? Lucky you, right? And I mean, it just so happens that other people have the same, think the same thing, and live somewhere else. But they may think the same way, but they're not right about that. No. You're the one of the right religion because the way you grew up is clearly how it is, right? And this acknowledgement that I noticed, like growing up, I noticed this sort of tendency of like, it just like, why is this automatically true just because it's the belief system here? Anyway, that's why I like the idea of universalization anyway, and something that Jungian psychology seems to certainly have a good grasp on. Subjectivization is the fact that the experience of the imago Dei, so the image of God, is subjective in nature, which fits in with the previous pillar. The concept of the law of one. The concept of the external, separate God is superseded by that of an inner God that speaks to us from within. This is something, was the author of War and Peace? Well, whatever his name was, he seemed to believe in something like that. Spinoza believed in something like that. pantheism, basically. And that's where it's at, in my opinion. The kingdom of God lies within, that concept. Rather than there's a sky god from out there and he created it and he was obey him without question and blah, blah, blah. And according to Gnosticism, there are archons who are fake. It's kind of the word for king, actually. And it's kind of like they're fake gods. They pretend to be gods, but they're fake. There's also the idea of what's the idea? Not the Antichrist, but it's the creator of the world that isn't God in certain religions, early versions of Christianity. The demiurge, that's it. There might be a link between the demiurge and archons, I'm not sure. But certainly, I would say that this idea of the sky god, the old man in the sky, that's actually, I associate that with Enlil, the Sumerian, quote, god, who many people think was one of the Anunnaki, basically the leader of the aliens who went to Earth to find gold to help fix their planet because of a war that had happened and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't like the idea. The idea of this happens to be an old man who's telling you what to do, and this happens to fit a certain old man archetype, and it's just like, come on. I mean, yeah. The idea that we have souls, the idea that we have souls is like not it is like fairly regularly understood to Christians anyway. So it's spirituality, the idea of the soul is pretty like widespread. And so what is a soul if not a divine part of us? It's not the true essence of what we are. And if it's a divine part of us, is it not the godhood part of us? Why would we not? I think all forms of spirituality, to me, pantheism or panpsychism, it makes no sense. Because it's this idea of the inner God, the spirituality, the part of God being everywhere, including within us. Including us. Relativization is the fact that no creed can claim ownership or exclusivity to any experience of the divine. Well, yeah, like I said, right? These limits are important in defining genuine mystical experiences and establishing that organized religion has no ownership of over these. There's always been this tendency to try to control and just logically codify and put labels on everything and make it neat and tidy for the left brain, but also for those in power who want to control people and the populace, right? And there's always been this tendency of chaos within humanity that we're not easy to control. And it's general in reality. You can't have absolute order. It always ossifies and falls apart gradually. And so there's this tendency of over order and perhaps excessive chaos, well, what have you. So there's this countervailing two-way process, back and forth, yin yang, etc. And just like the cabal or whoever these elites are, constantly trying to control things, constantly partially successful, and the people constantly trying to be free, constantly partially successful, and it goes back and forth in various degrees. And I would say that it's not so much that history repeats itself or even rhymes per se, but it's more like it's a spiral. It spirals up and sometimes it spirals down. The presence of Gnosticism in Liber Novus. Abraxas is part of the Gnostic tradition in which gods contain elements of both good and bad, and this was a problem that concerned Jung from an early age. Strictly speaking, Gnosticism was a worldview whose adherents believed in the existence of a demiurge, or an incomplete and flawed god that created a physical world. The god of the highest good, or summum bonum, represents the upper world and is not connected with the impurities and incompleteness of the material world. Okay, so to where I see this is that there's the creator and then there's the created. We live in a holographic universe, a fractal holographic universe, and the perhaps fractal source, fractal God, fractal infinite source, whatever you call it. So it's holographic and there's different layers of it. No, and it's, wow. There's created reality, and it's kind of a simulation from God, which is seeking to understand itself through experience, harvesting experience of many beings, all of which are it, and if they are all one with it, you know, we are all one, that sort of thing. There's a unity in the multiplicity of which is a whole, and yet it's not, it's one, and yet it's not just one, right? You know the concept. And so if there's the created, that created could be seen as a god. That material created three-dimensional aspect, matrix perhaps, could be seen almost in a sense as a god, but it's not the highest god. It's not the creator of all things. It's a lower material god. That's not to say that it doesn't have something like a divinity or something like a significance, but we must be aware of the holographic nature of reality and not put it up on a pedestal beyond the true creator, of which we are part of. And Gnosticism seems to appreciate this. And also there's a dualism. Is it dualism? Just dualism isn't the right word. There's a duality, a sense of black and white and other polarities, whereby so-called good and so-called evil, you know, these things, serving self, serving others, etc., these things exist in reality. This is the reality that we experience, even if ultimately everything's a unified one. And that's a fundamental aspect, because there's other notions of God, right, which are that it's all just love and light, that it's all just entire perfection. And that's the only thing that exists. And anything else, even what some might call evil, the idea that it's a confusion and a delusion from the true order. Like, if I'm correct, there was I think there was a reformer of the Orthodox Church at one point, or a theologian called Basil II, perhaps, or something, who had put forth this idea in the Byzantine Empire at the time. Yeah, and ultimately that ignores a whole part of reality, and it's ultimately like it's the ultimate spiritual bypassing, but in an organized religion, right? To ignore the dark side of reality, to say, well, it's not even real, but it is, right? And humanity had that dark potential. And then there's also, but then there's this other tendency Jung talks about where the potential for evil, so to speak, was something that is externalized and projected out as not within oneself, but rather as within the devil or Satan. And doing this doesn't deal with the contents of that, so it basically causes some level of repression, and that this became worse when the West became not just influenced by Christianity, but also secularized at the same time. And thus the unconscious content of religion and spirituality was no longer had an outlet. It no longer had an outlet, even the flawed outlet of Christianity. It was, so that made the problem even worse. Anyway, that's something I've mentioned a whole bunch of times in my podcast. Even in my first episode, I mentioned that. So the god of the highest good, or Sunum Bonum, represents the upper world that is not connected to the impurities or incompleteness of the material world. Abraxas contains these two opposites. So Abraxas is the whole of which these two parts are parts. His name reveals the era in which he was worshipped. Abraxas is a contradiction of Abir Axis, meaning bull at the pole, which was probably an age during which the spring equinox, the cosmic new year, fell within the astrological sign of Taurus. He had, before the age of Aries, so the age of Pisces is the one we're just coming out of. The age before that was the age of Aries, which was the Roman period and the Greeks and that sort of thing. If I'm correct, they're about roughly 2,000 years. Right. So before 2000 BC, that would make Abraxas, the Gnostic god, actually kind of old. And I make that, even though Gnostic Christianity is a thing, that it was highly influenced by pre-Christian Gnosticism. So it's kind of, the Gnosticism we're talking about with Abraxas is kind of Christian, but kind of not. That's my impression of it. Anyway, that's really interesting anyway, because astrology is something I'm interested in. That's also something that Jung was interested in his own way. Astrology is a particular significant thing now when we're moving into the age of Aquarius. So I'm curious about what the symbology of Taurus would mean for a whole age. So it'd be like passionate and emotional, but like, no, I was talking about personal training, and they're Taurus, and they're like, telling me what they're like. So like Taurus is like passionate and emotional, but they'll like, you know, like they'll stand up for their values and sort of thing, not to be messed with, I guess. That's my impression. So forthright, but not absolutely martial, like in the age of Aries. I admit I'm just going off the cuff with that. I can't exactly back that up, but I mean, this whole thing, it's not exactly I'm like a scientist, is it? Fell in the astrological sign of Taurus. He had the age of it. He had the head of an eagle, snakes for legs, a shield in his right hand, and a whip in his left. Judging by the representations and symbols, he was a very distinctive deity within the Judeo-Christian religions. Therefore, the images that Jung saw in his childhood preceded the important questioning of his religion that would find full symbolic expression in Liber Novus. And perhaps this symbol itself represented his questioning of religion. That seems to be implied here anyway. For what I said. These representations, still in their germination phase in the Red Book, were later developed and reached full maturity in Jung's writings in An Answer to Job and a range of other works dealing with the psychology of religion and religion. It can therefore be concluded that Liber Novus is a work of gestation since Jung's infancy, and is a symbolic product of his own product of personal development. I consider the tendency to attribute the production of the Red Book into his midlife crisis or any other personal or dilemma to be too hasty. In fact, yes, that would be kind of dismissing of him. And it's kind of like, yeah. The book emerged during a moment of crisis, and it is during such times that the conscious has more contact with the unconscious, causing opposites to collide, emotional turmoil to be felt, and synchronistic phenomena to occur with more frequency. And this is certainly something I can vouch for, and certainly at these times, you may well be have experienced synchronicity too, so, and more experience with the unconscious, especially during this last year, you know. In the case of Jung, his personal crisis coincided with the First World War. Mine coincided with COVID, but funny enough, my actual troubles weren't primarily caused by COVID. That's probably why I had other things that caused me catalyst instead. Because the catalyst was necessary, quite frankly, for our development, for this awakening. And while it was conspired to be brought about, partly by Bill Gates and also by the Cabal, I would say that on a higher spiritual level, it did play a role of actually benefiting the Great Awakening, pardon me, and undermining the Cabal's interests, despite the fact it was planned by the Cabal, because it forced people to be more introspective, more spiritual, or at least, you know, more in touch with spirituality indirectly and not necessarily intentionally, and question the establishment. And this crisis that people have gone through psychologically, have been going through more psychologically, perhaps more confronting their unconscious and more making more life changes in life and attitude, and it shakes things up, you know, away from the established way of doing things. Now, of course, the Cabal would want to use that to set about an order that suits their interests with a boot in the face, you know, for a long time. And, you know, they would want to bring about some sort of dystopia or something, right? Because for their dark interests. But while they may be attempting that, ultimately, it's those very things that are leading to the Great Awakening in this age of Aquarius. And there's a matter of different timelines. There are like, some are more successful than others in terms of like how quickly and how rapidly we awaken, but the awakening is guaranteed. That's what I've been hearing, and I'm sure you may well have heard that too. So, okay, so the appearance of the Red Book was an essential existential moment for Jung, which emerged from experiences from his past that would continue into the future and appear in his scientific formulations. All right, so you know what? That was 16 pages. All that, 16 pages. We've got 116 pages to go. I mean, we're like more than 10% through. Maybe like 15% through or something. You know what? I've noticed I'm starting to make more mistakes, so I'm going to take a break here. But perhaps I should mix up the episodes of this with episodes of something else, instead of just doing reading from this. But certainly, it was enjoying to read this. The advantage for me is that I get to do research at the same time as content. I know it's a bit too convenient for me, perhaps, but you know, when do I fit it in at the same time doing a lot of content? And that is my passion. I also I do feel like as a podcaster, you know, this style so far is more fitting than, let's say, doing highly edited videos that get in the way. That approach would perhaps get in the way of my creativity. And it's not that I don't value quality. It's just that I see quality as more emerging from a spontaneous approach rather than a more left brain approach. Because I mean, I can do that. Like I can be all left brain and highly analytical and pedantic about things, but I've done that enough in my life, right? I just want to flow. And if sometimes I'm just reading, that's okay. And other times I have ideas, I can go off the cuff and do that, you know? So hopefully you're enjoying this. I'm gonna do more in the future. I haven't exactly worked out what else I'll be doing. As for interviews, during this Christmas time, I probably won't be doing any, but I'll see if I can organize some stuff for afterwards, you know? So I hope you're having a nice time. I know it's a difficult time these days. It is difficult. And I don't know if you can see your family or not. But there is hope. There is definitely hope. Do you believe in the human spirit? Do you believe we can be trampled down this much forever? Do you think that we're going to give in? I believe that the people of Earth will stand up for themselves, will find themselves and rise in consciousness. I believe this is already happening. And now, after what's happened, when truth starts coming into light, when the truth has been hidden, and when people find out that they were misled, there's going to be, things are going to change. There may well be disclosure sooner than you think. There's this uncertainty coming, but I feel like, to the extent that you can, look after yourself this Christmas, but also perhaps prepare, because the trials are not over yet, but by the end of this year, we should be in a better place than we are now. So, all right, bye for now.